A tsunami warning has been called down in British Columbia following an earthquake off the coast of Alaska. Several communities opened evacuation shelters in response to warnings that came in the early morning hours. And Johanna Wagstaff is the CBC's senior meteorologist and seismologist. She is joining us to answer your questions here on CBC News Network and on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to ask her a question, head to facebook.cbc or facebook.com/CBC News or youtube.com/CBC News. Good afternoon to you, Johanna. So let's start with the earthquake itself. How powerful was it?
Well, Arthi, this was a big earthquake, as we've been saying, striking early this morning in Pacific time around 1:30, just south, about 200 kilometers south of Kodiak, Alaska. Latest magnitude estimates from the United States Geological Survey put it at a 7.9. That is a massive earthquake and fairly shallow as well, just 25 kilometers below the surface and out in the ocean. And all of those factors together are a real recipe for tsunamis, which is why the alerts came out so fast. I also just want to show you something else over here. This is a look at all of the latest aftershocks. So we've seen dozens of aftershocks in the area between magnitude 4 and magnitude 5. Many of them would be felt by those small communities in the Alaskan islands, but definitely no shaking felt across British Columbia, Arthi.
And Johanna, we also wanted to know, why this didn't actually produce a tsunami in the end.
Yeah, that was the big question this morning. All of the different factors, as I mentioned this morning, really pointed to the possibility for a large tsunami. I want to show you, though, what happened in the end. So this is a very seismically active area of the world. We've got a fault line that runs, let's see if I can expand this out, a fault line that runs all the way up the west coast of British Columbia and around the Alaska Panhandle. This is an area that transitions from side-to-side faults to what we call subduction faults, with a vertical component. So we had to wait to get the data in to know, first of all, what kind of earthquake it was. And it turns out it was a strike slip, so a side-to-side earthquake where the displacement is horizontal. We also had to wait for those first waves. And this earthquake did produce a tsunami, a very small one, but we had to wait for those first waves to reach sensors to actually know how high that tsunami wave was. So in the end, we didn't get enough displacement of the ocean floor to see a large-scale tsunami, luckily.
And now, as we mentioned, of course, to our viewers, we are taking your questions on CBC's Facebook page and also on our YouTube channel. And we do have a question here from Britta Simon. And pardon me if I've mispronounced your name. I hope it's okay, though. And here's the question that she has for you, Johanna. She says, I've heard that every 200 years or so, there's supposed to be a bigger earthquake that could impact even 100 miles inland. Is that so?
That is absolutely true. So I think Britta is referring to the Cascadia subduction zone. That's the earthquake zone that we have off the southwest coast of British Columbia, where that Pacific plate is trying to move under the North American plate. This is where we get that vertical displacement, the mega thrust earthquakes. The last time we saw an earthquake of magnitude 9 or higher was over 300 years ago. And we know that because of core samples. We can see when there was a tsunami based on core samples on both the BC coast and, funny enough, Japan as well. And we know that these megathrust earthquakes happen in a 300 to 500 year cycle. So we are due for one, but we also know it may be a couple hundred years before that we get that big one. We also know that megathrust earthquakes aren't the only kind of earthquake we get here on the west coast. Shallower but smaller earthquakes closer to major cities might be just as, if not more, damaging. And just that last point, if we do get a megathrust, when we do get a megathrust 9.0 or higher off the west coast of Vancouver Island, those waves will be felt as far east as Manitoba. That's how powerful this earthquake will be.
So perhaps you're saying that it's a long time to wait until one of those major events. But we've got another question here from John D. Hamilton. And he asks, odds of earthquake happening again in Alaska or off the BC coast?
So as I mentioned earlier, great question. There are so many different kinds of earthquakes we get in this tectonic setting. So here's the west coast of British Columbia. See if I can move this back up. Then that same plate line, it slides up towards Alaska. So we not only get these side-to-side type earthquakes, but we also get subduction earthquakes. And this is a huge boundary, again, running from Alaska all the way down through BC, all the way down Washington, Oregon, and into Northern California. That's all part of the same tectonic setting. So when the big one happens, it's going to basically unzip a section of the fault line that's been stuck for 200 plus years. We could be looking at a tear or a rupture that travels hundreds of kilometers. So that is a major risk, but we are also watching for the smaller, shallower ones closer to a city. So this earthquake doesn't actually alleviate any stress, but I know scientists will be watching to see where that stress transferred. And the aftershocks are really helping to tell us the story, helping to tell us how much of the plate or the fault line actually moved this morning.
And again, just a reminder for our viewers that Johanna Wagstaff is taking questions on CBC's Facebook page and also on the YouTube channel. And we're trying to get to as many as we can right now on air. I just want to bring up one more question here, at least that we've got here from James McLaughlin. And he asks, is there increased seismic activity in recent years, Johanna?
James, yeah, interesting question. There is no connection between an increase in seismic activity in the past few years. We've always had seismic activity and tectonic plates and earthquakes, and there is no connection to human activity, to moon cycles. That was a new study that just recently came out. So sometimes it seems like earthquakes happen in clusters, and when we do see earthquakes happening along a fault line, so if all of a sudden we see a larger earthquake slightly farther to the south or north along that Alaskan fault line, that is likely connected, and we will continue to see aftershocks. But there is no connection between one earthquake triggering another earthquake somewhere around the world, Arthi.
All right, and I've just got one final question from our viewers here, and of course a reminder that Johanna will continue to take your questions even after she's off air with us here. This is from Alana Doble, and she asks, how much more serious would this earthquake and its tsunami have to be in order to affect Vancouver Island?
Yeah, Alana, that was the big concern this morning. We could have absolutely seen a damaging tsunami wave across Vancouver Island this morning with a magnitude 7.9 if that displacement had been vertical under the ocean floor. But instead of the plates rupturing upwards, they ruptured side by side. But this is exactly the kind of scenario that we worry about and prepare for here on the West Coast, which is why today was the perfect test, not only for emergency officials, and they'll be testing and analyzing the response times, seeing if their communities got the message. And it's also a great test for people who live in seismically active zones, not just here on the West Coast, but many parts of Canada do see earthquakes, even though we see most of them here on the West Coast. But today is a great kind of test for people to get prepared, because this is exactly the kind of scenario where a damaging tsunami would be a big concern.
Thanks for this, Johanna. Now, sadly, I have to leave the conversation now, but Johanna Wagstaff will continue to take your questions on Facebook and on YouTube. So send your question to facebook.com/CBC News, and you can also follow at youtube.com/CBC News. Stay with us.
Okay, so if you're still with us, I dropped my phone. Thank you so much for everyone who continues to join us on YouTube and Facebook. I'm Johanna Wagstaff, background in seismology, and I can continue to answer your questions about earthquake risks. So keep the questions coming. Krista Leach asks, could you explain how a tsunami wave plays out through the straits and interacting with the islands? This is definitely something that officials and scientists are working very hard at. And there's been a couple of very big simulations run along the West Coast, simulations that have involved emergency officials actually playing out a magnitude 9.0 earthquake. I just want to zoom in on the coast of southern BC. So if we get a large earthquake with big displacement anywhere in the Pacific Ocean, there is a risk for BC's west coast. Obviously, the closer to Vancouver Island, the bigger the risk. But what will happen is the waves travel in, they'll actually wrap around the strait. So the east coast of Vancouver Island also at risk. We may see some tsunami waves move into the Burrard Inlet. For those of you in Metro Vancouver, the risk isn't as big, but coastal flooding definitely a concern. And I just want to show you, Port Alberni is a place that is at biggest risk on the east coast because it's at the end of an inlet, and those tsunami waves actually get funneled and accentuated as they move through the inlet. So tsunami risk right across Vancouver Island is a big concern. If I just take you over to this one, this is a graphic that Pacific Tsunami Warning Center tweeted out this morning. There's the earthquake up in Alaska, and here's the arrival times as it spreads out all across the Pacific. And it's just a reminder that these are concentric waves that move out, and not just one tsunami wave. There are several, kind of like dropping a stone in a pond. Eric Wald asks, how big was the slippage? Yeah, we're working on that, the slippage from this morning's Alaska earthquake. So as these two plates get locked together, it's actually the rocks slipping past each other, relieving that stress that causes an earthquake. The aftershocks that we're seeing, and I'm just going to pull up the latest aftershocks behind me. Here's the main quake, here all of the aftershocks. This is going to help scientists define the area of the Earth that actually broke. And so you can see we're starting to get an idea of how big that size might be. And I mean, we're talking, 100 kilometers long by maybe 50 kilometers wide. So it isn't just a point, even though the dot might reveal that. It's actually a whole section that slipped. Rachel Walter asks, is there a big one on the way for the Ring of Fire? So this earthquake, the Alaska one this morning, did occur on the Pacific Ring of Fire. That basically encompasses any coastline that interacts with the Pacific Ocean, because the Pacific Ocean is a tectonic plate in itself, and it's bumping and grinding and sliding with all of the continents and countries on that outside. That's where we see the greatest earthquake activity, the greatest volcano activity. British Columbia and Alaska are on that Pacific Ring of Fire. The earthquake risks vary depending on how recent earthquakes have happened, but yeah, we're waiting for multiple big ones around that Ring of Fire. Michelle Johns asks, what app do you suggest people have on their mobile devices? This is something that I know officials are working hard at right now. I would suggest going to your local community website, whether that be Vancouver, Tofino, Surrey. Your community has their own web page, and they will have different ways to get that message out for you. There's also Environment Canada, who's sending out the tsunami warnings, and they had it up on their website right away. BC Emergency has a Twitter account. They were sending tweets out, and you can actually set those emergency tweets on your phone to override silent functions or have a different alarm for it. But British Columbia is working very hard to get that message out to everyone via text message. Christine Knox asks, do we have any idea yet if and where the stress has been displaced? So because this is a big earthquake and we're still seeing those two rocks sort of settle into their new place as indicated by all these aftershocks, I know seismologists are going to be examining this very closely to see if perhaps stress was transferred farther down the line. I'm going to just take you back to, let's see here. So this is the tectonic setting for the northwest coast. So here's British Columbia, all around Alaska. This is the tectonic boundary in red. The Pacific plate is pushing and trying to subduct underneath North America. And the stress is sort of locked in a number of different places. So where we saw that 7.9, that's in that area that transitions from a side-to-side fault into a subduction zone. So we see a number of different earthquakes in here, and scientists will be looking to see where that stress happens. Sometimes it does move stress farther down the line and can trigger another earthquake. In this case, again, it was in that transition zone, but scientists will be trying to learn a lot from that. Tina Poole asks, how much warning can be given before a big earthquake happens? Glad we're going to have a moment to talk about early warning systems. There is no way to predict exactly when, exactly where, and exactly how big an earthquake will be. We know where there are big risks, and we call those seismic gaps. Those are the areas where they've gone silent because the two plates have become locked together. For example, off the west coast of Vancouver Island, there are these gapped sections all along the west coast of BC and Alaska. So we know where there are areas that are ready for an earthquake. We can't say when that'll happen. What we can do is give a few seconds to a few minutes of warning time with an early earthquake warning system. So when an earthquake happens, the first waves it sends out don't actually shake the ground. They can be picked up by sensors. The next waves happen very quickly after that, and the farther you are away from an epicenter, the more warning time you have. That's something British Columbia is working very hard to install in our schools right now, is an early warning system. We might only have a few seconds if the epicenter is really close to a warning system. We might have up to 5 minutes for those of us in Vancouver if a mega thrust earthquake happens. That's enough time to drop, cover, hold on, shut bridges, shut elevators. This is crucial life-saving time, so it's technology that we're working on. And that kind of answers Jason Dodd's question as well. I don't believe we'll ever be able to predict an earthquake. I know they're working on some interesting research right now. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, a new study came out where scientists were able to successfully predict earthquakes in a lab based on how the grains of sand moved just before an earthquake happened. In fact, upwards of a couple of hours before. But we are far, far away from implementing that in real life. So right now we are not able to predict earthquakes. Barb Harrison comments, since midnight last night, there have been over 40 earthquakes in Alaska and along the coast. Yeah, you'll be amazed by how much our Earth moves every day, and there are many apps you can download to see that. Yeah, good point, Barb. If I can just take you back to this map. This is Earthquakes Canada, or sorry, this is USGS Earthquakes. You can also check out Earthquakes Canada. We've got a great network of our own. But I like this one. It's earthquakes, real live earthquakes around the world right now, and you can see in the red, those are all of our fault lines. And notice how in orange, those are the recent earthquakes. They're all happening along those boundaries. So, you know, this is just one day magnitude 2.5 earthquakes or higher. So in one day, you can see all of the activity happening along that boundary. It's true, we get thousands of earthquakes happening around the world every year. Most of them we can't feel. About a dozen of them are damaging. A couple of them are quite deadly. So yeah, the earth between our feet is very active. These are just excellent questions. Thank you for everyone sending me comments and questions on Facebook and YouTube. If you're just joining me, I'm Johanna Wagstaff answering your seismology questions. Lisa Marie Parcher asks, how far inland would a tsunami travel if we were to get the big one? So scientists have done a lot of simulations on the west coast of, well, all over the world, in fact, but for us specifically, they've done a lot of simulations to see what exactly a tsunami wave would do once it interacts with the inlets, the coastal topography, the ocean topography, and that's why we know we're going to get a tsunami wave wrap around the strait and impact sections of the east coast. We're also looking at this kind of wraparound effect up towards Haida Gwaii. There are a lot of simulations out there. In fact, there was a big simulation in Port Alberni a couple of years ago with Ocean Networks Canada, and you can find that information online. I'll try and share it on Facebook afterwards, and you can see those waves attenuating. As far as how far inland, Burrard Inlet is likely to see a bit of a tsunami, but most of the simulations show that it won't move that far inland. It will, of course, move quite far inland by even kilometers across Vancouver Island. Stuart Timewell asks, in Ucluelet, we were told once the shaking stops, we have a max of 20 minutes to get to high ground. Yeah, if you're watching from anywhere on the west coast of BC, Vancouver Island, I can't imagine how terrifying this morning was to actually have to evacuate and get to these centers. So good on you for everyone who did, because this is muscle memory training for the next time this happens, and it is a damaging tsunami or earthquake. So talked about early earthquake warning systems for shaking. The early earthquake warning for tsunami is the shaking itself. If you live in a coastal community and you feel the ground shaking, take cover. When the shaking stops, 20 seconds is a great, actually, what did you say? Waiting, most people just say wait a minute for the shaking to stop, and then follow your evacuation orders. So the sirens will likely go in communities, hopefully, and again, that's something officials are testing today, but the shaking is your alert to get to higher ground if you live in a coastal community. Let's see here. Lots of great questions. What are the risks in through the Fraser Valley? I heard that a strong tsunami could come upriver. Yeah, we are concerned about tsunami moving inland through the inlet and through Fraser River. The impacts will be greater for the island. The island does protect us a little bit, but again, we get those waves wrapping around. And something else we're worried about is landslides underwater. So the shaking may trigger smaller tsunamis locally. And that is, again, something that scientists are watching very closely. We might not get hit by the main tsunami in the Fraser Valley, but it may trigger an underwater landslide that would then trigger a smaller tsunami. So yeah, if you live in coastal areas of the Fraser Valley, get to higher ground there too. Courtney Zed asks, what time did this earthquake happen? Happened at 1:31. Let me just double check that. Take you back here. 1:31 Pacific time. So very early in the morning, I have a couple of different earthquake apps. You can download a lot of free ones, and I actually set a region on my phone that alerts me when an earthquake goes off that's greater in magnitude 6 in a certain area. So I got the earthquake alerts on my phone at 1:30 this morning, and that's something that you might want to think about doing if you live in a seismic zone. We have, again, been seeing a number of aftershocks since then, and aftershocks might continue for hours, days, if not weeks or months from an earthquake this big. Lots of questions about a tsunami affecting Vancouver. Again, the main risk for Vancouver is actually a shallow earthquake that's closer to the city that might not be as big as a magnitude 7. A magnitude 5 or a magnitude 6 under the city of Vancouver would be more damaging in some ways than a bigger earthquake out to sea. So tsunami risk isn't as great, but again, if you live along the water, smaller landslides and tsunamis are possible. Lema Eldon asks, is it true that solar energies can cause natural disasters like tsunamis? So a couple of weeks ago, there was a new study. There was some suggestion in observations that there might have been a connection between earthquakes and moon signals. So the higher tide, the moon has such an influence on our oceans. Was that adding extra stress? Most seismologists didn't think that was the case, and a new study confirms there is no connection. So it's a natural cycle based on our molten outer core. It's that convective cycle that's moving those plates as the heat moves from the center out towards the outside, not connected to the solar or moon cycles. Okay, I'm going to just take a couple more questions. These are excellent ones, and I'll try and answer more of them online afterwards. Amy Boxall asks, do we know yet what caused the earthquake? So this was a section of the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate that had become locked. And technically, this section is a transition from one boundary to another. So there are a lot of different fault lines within here that can all rupture, and it was one of these fault lines that ruptured. We know we get a lot of earthquakes in here. You might have heard of the 1964 Great Alaskan Earthquake that did produce a large damaging earthquake. We've seen several magnitude 7s and higher since then in the past several decades. So this is a part of the world that does see a lot of earthquakes, and it's that stress buildup as those two plates are trying to slide beside each other. Okay, last question. What is your best piece of advice for when the big one hits? From Tara Hoggetson? And that's actually the best question to end off on. As I said before, today's event could not be a more perfect test for not just people living on the West Coast, but everyone across Canada. We get earthquakes in Ontario, Quebec, Northwest Territories, Alberta, and this is a reminder that we do live in an earthquake zone, especially here in BC. Get a kit, get a plan together, know where your evacuation routes are, and talk to your family about what you'll do in an earthquake. I know emergency officials are working hard to try and see how they can improve communications for future earthquakes, because there will be future earthquakes. So thank you everyone for joining me. I'm Johanna Wagstaff. My background's in seismology, and you've got some great questions. So see if I can answer some more on YouTube and Facebook. Take care. Thank you.